That was just Sarah calling me, forgetting we were doing our lecture right now. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first lecture of our virtual series for 2021. It feels like it's been forever since we did one of these. Our last one was in August last year. And we thought this year we'd hopefully be doing some in-person talks, but unfortunately we can't be doing that. So we're happy to be back here to deliver some interesting lectures digitally this time. And as always, we'll be recording today's lecture. So if you miss it or you have a friend who wanted to see it, we'll be posting that to our YouTube channel afterwards. We've also got the Q&A and the chat box down below. So if you have questions or any comments, feel free to type those in there. I will field them all to Amanda at the end of the presentation. Or if you just have comments that you want to add, I can read those out as well. So today we're welcoming one of our museum's own staff to present her research, and Amanda Balyk is currently working as our Tiny Museum coordinator here. She's developing school programming for this new outreach initiative that we're working on. And she's also an occasional teacher with the District School Board of Niagara, so she's keeping very busy. Amanda recently completed her Master of Arts in History at Brock University, and her historical interests are the 19th century British crime and gender, as well as Niagara-based history. And today, Amanda is going to be presenting An Atrocious and Abominable Offence, Textual Representations of Abortion and Shame in England, 1850 to 1870. So welcome, Amanda.
Thank you, Amy. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Like Amy said, my name is Amanda, and the presentation I'm going to be giving today is based on the research that I did for my master's under my supervisors, Dr. Jessica Clark and Dr. Tammy Friedman. So I just want to give a quick apology just because of the nature of this presentation. The slides are a bit wordy because I've added the quotations that I'm going to be talking about. So even though it's not the most visual presentation in the world, I still hope that you enjoy. And like Amy said, if there are any questions at all, please feel free to share them in the chat, and I'll be happy to answer them after. I can't see it as I go, but yeah. So I just wanted to give a quick content warning. I'm going to be talking about abortion as the title suggests. And so there's going to be some topics about shaming language towards those who resort to abortion. So if that's something that might make you uncomfortable, I just wanted to make you aware. So in 1861, the Lancet Medical Journal reported on a case in Leicester wherein a so-called midwife named Elizabeth Goddard stood trial for murder after an abortion went wrong. The anonymous columnist asserted, "The trade of abortionist, we are ashamed, we are half afraid to confess to the horror, has become a regularly established money-making business, carried on by both sexes, and its deluded victims, poor, nervous, pale, and sallow creatures, mere skeletons of what they once were, may be daily seen in our thoroughfares and at health-restoring resorts." In 1861, medical men like the one writing here in the Lancet were increasingly concerned with the trade of abortion threatening their newly legitimized profession, and asserted these anxieties within the medical text, including the Lancet. The Medical Act had introduced a medical register to differentiate between qualified and unqualified practitioners 3 years prior, before this quote, but quacks continued to practice which they viewed as a threat. To give a little bit of background on the Lancet, which is going to be the basis of my talk today, the Lancet Medical Journal was founded as an independent weekly medical journal in 1823 by Thomas Wakley, an English surgeon. Its goal was to make science widely available so that, quote, medicine can serve and transform society and positively impact the lives of people. That comes right from the Lancet's website in 2020. This included Wakley's active attempts to expose quackery and fraud in medicine until his death in 1862. His pursuit was made abundantly clear through the shame-inducing language that the journal published in relation to abortion specifically. Wakley was concerned with medical and legal reform, But the Lancet actually had a really wide readership at the time due to its coverage complementing a variety of tastes, as one historian has put it. So why did medical practitioners care about abortion? That is the big question. Between 1850 and 1870, mostly anonymous medical men used the Lancet to emphasize their anxieties around quack medicine, untraditional medicine. That included abortions. And people who were quacks functioned under the facade of legitimate medical practice in their eyes. Physicians' anxieties over quack doctors related in part to broader processes of professionalization occurring in the mid-19th century in the medical field. The drawing of distinction between qualified and unqualified practitioners really underscored what the medical men were writing about, specifically about abortion in the mid-century, because abortion had emerged as one of the key quack treatments that concerned qualified physicians. Leading up to the Medical Act passed in 1858, which I'll talk about in a little more depth as we go, physicians were concerned about the necessity for a register for identifying what they considered legitimate trade and practice. And after the Act's passing, newly registered physicians increasingly targeted those quacks threatening their newfound legitimacies. Authors writing in the Lancet, most anonymous, mobilized shame-inducing language in their writing to ensure clarity in that differentiation. This was intimately tied to professionalizing processes and establishing an honorable standing of medical men. Historians of shame, like William Miller, are in agreement that shame itself acts as the antithesis or the opposite of honor. And shame, therefore, has the ability to construct, destroy, and recreate hierarchies within society of moral and social rank. And historians like David Nash and Anne-Marie Kilday, two historians that were really closely influenced my own research, they assert that shame is a primary social emotion with the ability to convey messages. And because of that, it can be weaponized towards people. One cannot claim that those accused of abortion felt shamed by the discussions in the Lancet, and that's not the intent of this research. Rather, this presentation takes up Nash and Kilday's assertion that shame can be mobilized to articulate grievances and regain control over social situations. By looking at the language used in the Lancet, when discussing 5 distinct abortion trials between 1850 and 1870, it's really clear that doctors in Britain were not interested in the morality of women receiving abortions. This is something that has been talked about in historiography in the past. Rather, their self-interest drew from the desire to protect their self-proclaimed honorable profession. And physicians subsequently used abortion as a vehicle to assert their authority rather than their role as moral arbiters. In this time, medical men used the languages of shame in the Lancet when airing grievances about quacks practicing abortion under the facade of qualified physicians. And in doing so, they attempted to maintain honor and professional legitimacy in a newly established and thus seemingly fragile field. So our first case is in 1853, when Charles Cunningham, James Thompson Curry, and George Thomas were indicted for using an instrument to procure miscarriage onto Eliza Marden. Witnesses and doctors testified, and in the end, it was only Cunningham, the man who claimed he was a surgeon and actually performed the abortion, was sentenced to 15 years transportation for his crime, a common punishment wherein the guilty party was sent to a penal colony. According to coverage in the Times newspaper, the judge proclaimed that there was, quote, too much reason to believe that he had been carrying on a wicked trade, and that he had abused the noble science to which he belonged for the most base purpose. And under such circumstances, his duty as a judge left him no alternative but to pass a severe sentence. The judge's reference to this wicked trade of abortion under the guise of noble science gave Lancet contributors much to discuss. And on May 7th, 1853, the Lancet edition addressed the Cunningham case in length. An anonymous author began by outlining, quote, "The trust reposed in the practitioner of medicine is one of the most sacred that can be confided to man," end quote. While the author begins this article as a tribute to the honorable medical profession and what it looks like, the author continued, noting, quote, "There hangs upon the skirts of our noble profession a pestilent race, ever ready to pander to vice, and who seem to wield the broken scraps and fragments of medical knowledge, with no other purpose than illicit gain, and no other effect than ruin and misery to their victims," end quote. This introduction to the Cunningham abortion case differentiates this ideal medical relationship from the pestilent race that threatens physicians' proper pursuits of medicine for their own illicit gains. This direct comparison of legitimacy and illegitimacy characterizes the anxieties that plagued medical professionals pre-Medical Act. So while the author in the Lancet shamed by differentiating, the author also uses the Cunningham case as an example of why an official medical register was necessary in Britain. He claims that the Cunningham case illustrates one of the, quote, "worst consequences of the free trade, free scope afforded to a legal practice in this country," end quote. And continues, "It is not to be endured that the effect of our laws or the lax administration should tolerate the reckless assumption of medical practice by the ignorant and the unprincipled, who by parading the false insignia and titles of our profession are thus confounded in the eyes of the public with honorable men, and permitted to vilify and discredit an honorable profession by having an existence that is drawn from the daily practices of fraud." The anonymous author in the Lancet in this instant directs shame not only towards the procurers of abortion by maintaining that their practice is fraud through their use of medical titles, but also towards lawmakers by claiming that their laws are the reason that the ignorant and unprincipled were able to practice under this facade. This mention of honor even further reiterates the nature of shame and honor as opposites by producing shaming language towards ignorant quacks while praising honorable men who will be discredited by their practice. Overall, the harsh language used in the Cunningham case emphasizes the differences between qualified and unqualified and was motivated by physicians' deep desire to codify their professional authority. And so Cunningham's use of a professional title of surgeon really gave the Lancet authors a means to plead their case for professionalization. And in 1858, they got their wish when the Medical Act was passed into legislation. The Medical Act established a statutory definition of a medical practitioner, which governs standardized conduct and education and sought to distinguish qualified from unqualified for those seeking medical attention. Following the Act's passing, the Lancet authors celebrated it in its August 7th, 1858 edition, when it outlined the Act for its readers. The author declared, quote, "It is that quackery and illegal practice have flourished amongst us to a degree which is probably unparalleled in any civilized country in the world. But under the simple powers of the new Act, unqualified practice ought to become as rare in medicine as it has long been in the law. In this respect, an immense advantage has been gained. A medical profession, having a collective vitality, will soon reduce quacks and pretenders within its ranks to their proper proportions." end quote. While this article, again written by an anonymous author, but a medical man nevertheless, is celebrating the passing of the Medical Act, and it doesn't explicitly condemn abortionists, the language used here is very similar to that used in treatments of abortionists, by emphasizing that quacks and pretenders would be reduced in their ranks. Something else that is really noteworthy in the Lancet's celebratory column on the passing of the Medical Act is that it claims, quote, "No man shall practice medicine or surgery except under heavy penalties, unless his name be contained in the medical register." This point is particularly significant as the Medical Act itself actually uses the term persons when discussing qualified practitioners. And the Act itself did not specify that only men could be registered. So the use of male pronouns in the Lancet's coverage of the Act is telling of physicians' desire to have a male-centric monopoly on the profession, as the language shifted from that originally used in the Act to erase female physicians. Indeed, the Medical Act did not in itself exclude women, but the Act did specify that in order to be registered, one must possess a degree, diploma, or license from one of the 19 examining boards. The issue with this stipulation is that the examining boards refused to admit women to any examinations, which ended up having a register attached to it. There were exceptions. There were some women in the Medical Act by the 1870s that came from extenuating circumstances. But physicians became increasingly involved in regulating female medical reformers. Male physicians' desire to assert their authority using shaming language connects to previous failures to professionalize the field. And their desire to monopolize the medical field and push traditionally female roles out of what they consider to be their greater scientific knowledge. This was not a new phenomenon, and it actually began in the 17th century when medical men actively vilified midwives and devalued assigned female roles and traits, using examples of the Christian Church's obsession with witchcraft and its connection to childbirth. Following the witchcraft craze into the 18th century, medical practitioners began to use their greater scientific knowledge of biology to systematically dispute and devalue midwives' knowledge, which resulted in physicians again turning to abortions as a key component to their knowledge and moral superiority over midwives. And this was really highlighted in an 1861 illegal abortion and murder trial. In 1861, midwife Elizabeth Goddard was convicted for the willful murder of Sarah Kellam after Goddard performed an operation to terminate Sarah's pregnancy. The treatment of this case in the Lancet speaks to general anxieties that registered physicians felt following the passing of the Medical Act. But more importantly, it's the only case in this timeline to feature a female practitioner in this period, which further complicates medical men's beliefs in the masculine honor of their profession. The male-dominated nature of the medical profession was front and center in the medical press's coverage of the Goddard case. The March 23rd, 1861 issue of The Lancet included a full-page spread about Goddard and her companions, that is, other well-known male and female abortionists, and used shaming language to differentiate between quacks and legitimate practitioners, something that we've seen. The anonymous author in The Lancet claimed, quote, "The whole system is bad. The system of allowing any ignorant knave to practice what delusion or bestiality he chooses, or any ignorant old woman to term herself a midwife. It is evidently amongst these people that active instruments of mischief lie. The code of medical ethics, the high sense of honor pervading the legitimate ranks of the profession, as well as the ordinary rules of morality, effectually prevent, of course, all pandering upon the parts of the medical profession. This excerpt directly compares the code of medical ethics with its high sense of honor to those ignorant quacks who caused mischief by indulging in an act under the guise of legitimate medical practice. Unlike in the Cunningham case, which emphasized an explicit comparison between legitimacy and illegitimacy, the discourse and the language in Goddard's case specifically focuses on vilifying the ignorant knave practicing delusion, or the ignorant old woman terming herself a midwife, without directly comparing them to characteristics of a registered physician. Oops. So the excerpt further reveals a frequent trend in medical press coverage of such cases. Medical men writing for the Lancet shamed quacks practicing abortion in attempts to solidify a hierarchy of which professional legitimate medical men were at the top. They were the all-knowing, and these quacks and everyone else are on the bottom. The Lancet, in continuing to discuss the Goddard case, asserted, quote, "The evil lies at the door of a loathsome parasitical race, which preys upon the follies and vices of mankind. They are slayers of the body and polluters of the mind. Allowing the free trade of abortions to continue is nourishing a serpent and its heart, whose venomous fangs are ever ready to dart poison of some kind into its circulating current. Abortion is infecting this land in so virulent a manner as must soon call for some direct interference of the legislature for the purpose of arresting the crying shame." In this instance, in what I argue is some of the harshest language used by authors in the Lancet, the author compares abortionists to a parasitical race that aims to slay the body and pollute the mind, and compare abortionists to snakes ready to poison their victims. The explicit shaming and sensationalist language aim to situate abortionists at a lower tier of society completely, deeming them a completely different race, again reinforces this social hierarchy of shame through shame. Lancet authors advocated for the deployment of legislation to limit the misfortune wrought by abortionists, but also the threat that they represented to the medical field more generally. Finally, the Goddard case also presents the first case where the victim is also presented as a perpetrator, which blurs the line between victim and perpetrator. Indeed, in language similar to that used in the Cunningham case before the Medical Act, the Lancet author attests that crimes committed by Goddard reveals problems with the, quote, "dangerous laxity of the present law, which permits the most worthless persons to engage in the responsible practice of medicine." And what's more, they go on to say, quote, "There cannot be a reasonable doubt that Sarah Kellam, herself a guilty party, was destroyed by the injuries inflicted upon her in the attempt to procure her abortion. The midwife was sentenced to death. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, expressed a hope that the result of this trial would prevent others from pursuing the dreadful calling, which the prisoner, there was reason to believe, had carried on for some years." Here, the Lancet is using language that reflects changes that actually were brought in legislation only 5 months later, which designated that the woman seeking abortion was also the guilty party. The placing of the burden of guilt upon women obtaining an abortion was codified in 1861 via the Offences Against the Person Act. The Offences Against the Person Act reformed an 1837 abortion law. The 1837 Offences Against the Person Act dissolved previous distinctions of pre- and post-quickening abortion. Quickening, meaning fetal movement, typically occurring around 3 to 4 months gestation. Previous to this, only post-quickening abortions, post 4-month abortions, were a capital offense to be punished by death. And pre-quickening abortions were given a non-capital offense, which varied. And it also replaced the death penalty for abortion with a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. The 1861 reform of this specified that any attempt made by the pregnant woman herself to supply her own or seek abortion would be an indictable offense. This was the first mention of the woman herself being liable or guilty for turning to abortion. Physicians were increasingly concerned that the induction of abortion, be it by drugs or instruments, was a dangerous procedure with high risk of mortality for the woman and a low possibility of success. Historian John Kewen asserts that there's substantial evidence suggesting that medical men pushed for reform in the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act, not only out of concern for the welfare of the victims, but with an eye for furthering their status as a profession. Because if they were able to talk to legislation or to talk to lawmakers and have their influence, it automatically moved them up that social hierarchy that they were so concerned about. These legal shifts aided doctors' self-interest, as the Offences Against the Person Act was meant to add the burden of guilt onto the woman should she choose an abortion. And they hoped that by tightening the abortion law, it would lead to fewer quacks threatening their professional honor by practicing abortions under the facade of qualified practitioner. As they pointed out the laxity of the law in the Goddard case, it is clear that physicians thought that by tightening the law and shifting the burden of guilt onto women, the spotlight may no longer fall on quack physicians, which would also take the spotlight off of them and their profession. And only a few months later, we do see the Offences Against the Person Act in action when Fanny Warboy is indicted for self-procuring her own miscarriage. In trial records, Fanny mentions using an instrument provided to her by a man named Morgan, who had twice used the instrument on other women to complete an abortion. Something that was really notable to me is that Morgan was not indicted for his role in the abortion, which is completely different from the previous two cases that we've seen. And it's unclear to me why that was the case. So I wish I knew, but just something notable. Fanny fell dangerously ill following the procedure and received medical attention from a surgeon who found her in a, quote, dying state. The surgeon attended to her until she was recovered enough to attend trial, though the Times newspaper reported that she was still, quote, evidently in a severe state of bodily suffering. The jury was apparently unsympathetic to Fanny's ill demeanor and found her guilty. And Justice Blackburn, in sentencing Fanny, asserted that this was a serious offense, but due to her being the first conviction under this new law and the extent of her suffering, he would only imprison her for 3 months. In the following coverage of the Fanny Warboy case in The Lancet, the anonymous authors never actually mention Fanny Warboy by name, unlike in the previous two cases when an accused performed an illegal abortion under the guise of legitimate medicine. This omission is notable as they were clearly not looking to vilify Fanny in the same way that they were illegal abortionists. The anonymous author argued in the August 30th, 1861 Lancet issue that females who voluntarily submitted to criminal abortion were undoubtedly the guilty participators. However, in contrast to the common shaming descriptions of abortionists as frauds or of a pestilent race, they referred to women seeking abortions as, quote, unhappy persons who suffer the penalty of pain and severe illness. While this initially does seem a bit more sympathetic, The author continues that, quote, "The dread of this suffering has by no means sufficed to deter them from the shameful resort to these dark practices." The author goes on to express that there was a great demand for the nefarious skill and that a severe penal code should be enforced against women who solicited abortion. In this moment, the author insinuates that if the legal onus, the burden is on the woman, encouraging them to avoid abortion, then then the trade itself would diminish, consequently removing the threat against legitimate medical practitioners. Following the author's careful attention to women seeking abortions, they do move into a more recognizable use of shaming language towards male abortionists. The author states, quote, "While indignation against the criminal, who is also the sufferer, cannot but be tempered with pity, it burns with undiminished fire against those numerous and dangerous scoundrels, a class of men whose activity is far greater than appears on the surface of society, and more vigorous efforts than have yet been made are needed to secure their punishment and restraints," end quote. This suggests that the men writing in the Lancet saw other men as the true risk against their legitimacy, not the women seeking abortions. Fanny's case proves that there was a market of the trade to continue, and so there was needed this professional differentiation. Fanny's case also marked the start of the state's move to prosecuting women for obtaining an abortion to control family planning. Tellingly, for the remainder of the 1860s, Fanny actually does remain the only woman indicted in the Old Bailey for attempting to procure her own abortion. So by this point, medical men have influenced the passing of the Medical Act, which professionalized their field, and have influenced a tightening in previous abortion law. So what is next for them? In coverage of Cunningham, Goddard, and Fanny Warboy, anonymous authors in the Lancet focus entirely on the despicable field of illegal abortionists. However, following the passing of the Offences Against the Person Act in 1861, the Lancet maintains the shaming language. But medical men focused on a new group to denounce: periodical press journalists, newspaper writers who perpetuated quacks' false titles in print. In 1861, an article was published in the Lancet entitled "Pseudo-Physicians" that discussed, quote, "every drug dealer and abortion monger who wishes to bind himself to the chariot of sin in order to gather some of its more profitable wages dons the title of doctor," end quote. In doing so, the author insinuated that these illegal abortionists were of a lower class, acting in wages of sin against the qualified medical profession, which is consistent with the cases that we've seen so far. The author ends his article by expressing that it was, quote, "the fashion now for rogues and fools to hide their features beneath a doctor's cap. And while there is no help for this nuisance, we cannot forbear from uttering a word of remonstrance against the easy manner in which these fellows are allowed to pass publicly under their false titles. And with the compliance with which the newspaper reports, they are often decorated in their assumed designation through all the long detail of their villainy and its punishment." This sentiment points to frustration felt by physicians, as they were 5 years post-Medical Act by this point. While they could self-regulate the medical profession through the register and through the act, the periodical press, the newspapers, were beyond their control and continued to threaten their legitimacy. The grievance against newspapers perpetuating coverage of quacks practicing under allegedly legitimate titles again signaled the stakes that medical men had in abortion cases, as they tainted their legitimate medical reputation when allegedly learned, registered doctors were practicing such an abhorrent crime. While the language often takes on a moral tone, the main priority here continues to be using abortion to assert their authority, as their concern with the newspaper is not with the crime itself, but with the misuse of doctor or surgeon. And this really comes to a head in an 1869 case, the fourth case we're looking at here. The Times reported that Henry Timson, a surgeon, according to the press, though a laborer in practice, and William McGrath were convicted of felonies. Timson for causing the abortion of Rosina Bush, and McGrath for procuring and inciting him to do so, for seeking him out. 17-year-old Rosina was staying with her aunt and her cousin, who was, at the time of the trial, married to McGrath. The trial initially went before the Old Bailey in August, but after insufficient evidence was found, the two were retried in October. The testimony reported that when Rosina was 16 years old, she was left alone with McGrath, and he, quote, availed himself the opportunity to seduce her, end quote, from which she became pregnant. In her 8th month of gestation, McGrath induced Rosina to go to Timson to terminate the pregnancy. McGrath himself disclosed this information to police, and both he and Timson were arrested. Interestingly, in the trial transcript, it's clear that McGrath himself actually attempts to use shame out of self-interest by claiming that Rosina was a prostitute for 2 years before he was alleged to have seduced her. This is important because by the 1850s, prostitution was deemed the great social evil. And so McGrath's deflection reinforces popular ideals around the immorality of commercial sex work, trying to sort of deflect all of the blame onto her. After this, McGrath's attempt to deflect guilt by claiming he was the victim of her seductions and not the other way around was his attempts to alleviate the burden of guilt. However, the judge just straight up tells him that he does not believe his claims, so it doesn't work. In August 28th, 1869 article in The Lancet entitled Journalistic Amenities, the author called the journalism of the Times newspaper offensive and disingenuous, and claimed that characterizing Timson as a surgeon was an impudent libel upon medical men. It speaks to the self-interest of medical men, exposing frauds and their lack of mention of McGrath for his role. They're only concerned with Timson and his use of surgeon. The author continues that, quote, no exigency of journalism or indeed of sensationalism can justify the name of an honorable profession being used in this way as a bait to catch the attention of the public. The author's invoking of sensationalism definitely relates to the stark rise in newspaper readerships in about the 1840s, where several new newspapers were developed, which gave all classes of people the opportunity to choose their reading materials. So this included sensational news of crime and scandal. So it's possible then that by briefly mentioning that Timson was a laborer, but focusing on his alleged medical background, the Times journalist was attempting to profit from a scandalous story of an honorable medical man committing such an abominable crime. The Times was read worldwide and was widely regarded as a newspaper of the record, suggesting widespread readership. And by drawing attention to the sensational nature of such claims, The Lancet is attempting to shame journalists into reporting facts like they're supposed to do. So following the retrial, during sentencing, the judge actually uses shaming language himself by telling Timson that he had been convicted of an atrocious and abominable offense. And it was only persons of Timson's class who undertook for mere filthy lucre to assist young women to hide their immorality, of which they had been guilty. He noted, quote, "It should be known that no medical man carrying on the business in which Timson had been engaged would be allowed to escape without terrible punishment whenever he was brought to justice and convicted," end quote. In some ways, the judge's tone and language matches the shaming language used in the Lancet by medical men. By pointing out an entirely different class, it acts to differentiate abortion mongers from respectable and honorable facets of society, in a similar way that medical men attempt to differentiate quacks and professionals. Timson was found guilty of his crime and punished to penal servitude for 10 years. McGrath was also found guilty and sentenced to 7 years penal servitude, 3 years less than Timson. It's notable that the judge acknowledged Timson's position as a medical professional without making any reference to the medical register or other professional apparatus that regulated the trade. Yet the judge explicitly claimed that Timson's punishment was more severe than McGrath's due to his medical background. As you can imagine, the Lancet did not appreciate this very much, those writing in the Lancet. And despite the Lancet's previous discussions that the Times was offensive and disingenuous for printing false titles, in the coverage of their retrial, the Times actually maintains that Timson is a surgeon, and it struck a nerve with the medical men. And an October 2nd, 1869 issue of the Lancet published an article entitled "Abortion Mongers," in which the author wrote, again anonymous, "We, in common with all respectable citizens, were exceedingly rejoiced that 2 villains were convicted of illegal abortion. Our satisfaction would have been complete had not Henry Timson, one of the pair, been described as a surgeon, a view which the learned judge appeared to sanction when he carried on the sentencing," end quote. The article goes on to explain that a group of physicians had found no reason why Timson had dubbed himself a surgeon, as his name did not appear in the medical register, the medical directory, or the calendar of the College of Surgeons in England. They concluded then that Timson had no right to a medical title and likely had never received any sort of medical education. The article ends with the author urging, quote, "officers of justice to take the trouble to refer to the authorized medical register before accepting the claim of every ignorant quack to the honorable titles of the profession." Just for timing's sake, this is 11 years post-Medical Act that we're talking about here. By verifying that Timson did not appear on the register, the qualified position once again sought to reinforce a professional hierarchy by separating their profession from quack medicine, and doing so using shaming language. And then in the following issue of the Lancet, Robert Barnes, the only named author in this study that writes in the Lancet, responded to the abortion mongers article from the previous week. Barnes had attended the trial of Timson and McGrath and claimed that an authenticated copy of the medical register was provided, which proved that Timson's name was not there. However, the counsel, who Barnes believed had, quote, "sincere regard for the honor of the medical profession," end quote, declined to bring this up in court, as they believed that the verdict would have been guilty either way. It made no difference if Timson was qualified. But this brings up a really important question about the punishment given to Timson. Would it have been harsher had he been a registered practitioner? While the council argued that it didn't matter, this omission did likely contribute to the sensationalist tenor in the press and risk tainting the medical profession. Barnes not only uses his letter to the editor to discuss his experiences at court, he also uses the Timson case to propose a universal rule for qualified practitioners. He suggests, quote, an imperative rule universally and religiously observed by the medical profession, never to perform the operation for induction of labor except after consultation. Essentially by saying that if all doctors refuse to practice medicine in their homes, that women wouldn't be able to go to these quacks and claim that they didn't know that they were illegitimate. If all practitioners agreed, quacks could not be tried and referred to as surgeons and would no longer need physicians to defend their honor in the Lancet. And for our final case, what happens when a registered physician whose name appears in the medical register is in fact tried for illegal abortion? The first and only case of a physician registered in the Medical Act being indicted in the Old Bailey for illegal abortion and then removed from the register occurs in 1870, 12 years after the Medical Act was passed. On June 5th, 1870, Edwin Lowe, a dentist registered under the Medical Act, was indicted for administering to Mary Emily Harris a drug to procure her miscarriage. According to testimony printed in the Reynolds newspaper, Mary had consulted Lowe about her teeth when an improper intimacy occurred and she became pregnant. The Illustrated Police News reported that Lowe had shown Mary an instrument which he wanted to use to procure miscarriage, claiming that he had used it in other cases without danger, but Mary declines his offer. After this, Lowe admits to sending Mary a prescription of an unspecified mixture of medicine, which would terminate the pregnancy. During the trial, Lowe attempts to actually weaponize shame in his own way by immediately attempting to deflect the blame onto Mary herself. He initially does this by invoking the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act, which we're familiar with, and blaming Mary that she was an accomplice in the matter and had sought him out. But the court rejects Lowe's claims because Mary claimed that she had gone to Lowe for financial assistance and not an abortion when Lowe sent her the prescription by mail. While Lowe's deflection certainly reflects the 1861 Act, judges rarely tried, let alone convicted, women in abortion cases. When his suggestion of Mary's alleged guilt did not work, he deflects shame in a similar way to McGrath by claiming that Mary was a prostitute, and by claiming that if she were pregnant, it were by a man by the name of Williams and not him. However, Mary claims that she doesn't know anyone by the name of Williams, and Lowe admits that he did in fact send the prescription to terminate the pregnancy. Expert witness Dr. Owen Evans was consulted in the trial, and he claimed that the mixture would undoubtedly procure a miscarriage and expressed surprise that any respectable chemist would prepare it. The judge asserted that Lowe's case was serious, and in, quote, every case where a professional man took advantage of his position to act in the manner he appeared to have done, the court felt imperatively called upon to pass a severe sentence, end quote. Lowe was subsequently found guilty and ordered into penal servitude for 5 years, half the length of Timson in the previous case. So an anonymous Lancet author discussed Lowe's removal in August, claiming that we, quote, cannot but admire this vigilance on the part of the council, end quote. Interestingly, the author implies that this may not be a frequent occurrence, as they take Lowe's dismissal as an opportunity to, quote, most respectfully inquire whether it might not be possible to carry similar vigilance a step further and to remove one or two notorious persons from the list, end quote. The anonymous author concludes by stating that they believe that the recognition of Lowe's unfitness by the council would, quote, arrest the steps of some, at least, of those men who begin with small lapses and who sink in time to baby farming and the procuring of abortion, end quote. While the language in the Lancet's coverage of Lowe's case did not utilize shame quite as severely as in discussions of Cunningham or Goddard, for example, their celebration of his removal from the medical register further reinforces an honor-based profession with an inherent hierarchy. In this regard, Lowe's case was monumental, as after 12 years of the Medical Act being in practice, it was the first case of a man's name being taken off for an illegal abortion. Where the Lancet spends several articles covering quacks performing illegal abortions, coverage of the Lowe case was only in one issue with a relatively short piece. Regardless, the Lowe case marks years of physicians condemning the work of illegal abortionists, and the Lancet resulting in a celebratory article where their denouncements in the law work together to remove a quack hidden among them. So it's 1870, it's 12 years after the Medical Act, 8 years after the Offences Against the Person Act. Is there any inclination of doctors slowing down? The answer to that appears to be no. I began with a quote, and so I want to end with a quote before I get to my conclusion. In August 1870, an issue of the Lancet used severe shaming language in denouncing quacks acting under the name of doctor. This is occurring around the same time that Edwin Lowe is taken off of the medical register, but he himself is not brought up. The anonymous author notes, quote, nothing is more common than for some villainous quack or abortion monger or other scoundrel to be brought up at police court and to call himself doctor or a surgeon or a retired surgeon, as the case may be. He appears the next day in newspapers as Dr. A or as John B, a surgeon, as if his tale were at least a probable one. The conduct of our brethren in the press is in this matter the less excusable because of the imposture attempted of easy detection. There exists a book called the Medical Register, and it would be a remarkable coincidence if the few men who may be wrongly placed in it or wrongly omitted from it should also find themselves at variance with the criminal law, end quote. I love that quote. I think it's kind of sassy. If only there were a book. The author was clearly frustrated with the press's reinforcement of quacks practicing legitimate medicine, which even further suggests a lag in the professionalization process, as physicians for 12 years had been self-regulating under the Medical Act, and yet the courts, the press, and the public continued to fall for false titles. As we've seen throughout this presentation, qualified physicians' greatest anxieties stemmed from quack physicians practicing under the facade of qualified practitioner and tainting the honorable profession. The author in this case of the Lancet concludes that, quote, in the name of an honorable profession, we feel that we are entitled to request magistrates and editors to remember the existence of the medical register, end quote. So to conclude, in the mid-19th century, doctors were invested in maintaining and improving the honor of their profession, and in turn used shaming language in the Lancet to denounce those who threaten this by performing illegal abortions. Previous to the passing of the 1858 Medical Act, physicians advocated for a legal code that regulated their field. As seen in the Cunningham case, physicians sought to designate standards to legitimize their profession, and in order to prove that their work was honorable, they detailed denunciations of abortionists. Following the 1858 Medical Act, doctors faced similar issues that forced them to continue to use shaming language to differentiate themselves from quacks who practice medicine under the guise of qualified. If qualified practitioners were found guilty of procuring abortion, they would be deregistered, as was the case with Edwin Lowe in 1870. This did not prevent other itinerant traders from operating under the facade of legitimacy. In the immediate years after the passing of the Medical Act, the medical profession was new and consequently fragile. In the 3 years between the Medical Act and the Offences Against the Person Act, between 1858 and 1861, medical men turned from advocating for a medical register to advocating for stricter legislation against abortion, as seen in the Goddard case, where they blamed the laxity in what was then the 1837 Offences Against the Person Act. If legislation was stricter, perhaps it would deter abortionists from performing the wicked trade. After the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act, however, there continued to be convictions of mostly men still practicing under the title of surgeon, as seen in the Timson case, prompting physicians to shift gears. Rather than exclusively using shaming language towards the accused, they also attempted to induce journalists to check the medical register before perpetuating false titles, a process that comes to a head when Henry Timson is tried. The threat was still in quacks practicing under false pretenses, but the issue was exacerbated when journalists failed to properly characterize defendants, thereby threatening carefully calibrated professional hierarchies. Overall, the case studies in this presentation occurred at distinct moments in relation to these legal shifts, revealing some differences, but more often continuity in the language used to address abortion cases. Despite doctors' shaming throughout the mid-19th century, itinerant traders continued to practice, and by the late 19th century, they were even advertising their services, albeit under coded language. They weren't saying, "We offer abortions." They were saying, "We will provide cures for female obstructions." It was coded language. Doctors' self-interest in abortion practices continued into the 20th century when the profession supported the passing of the Abortion Act in England in 1967. The Act's central focus was to abolish underground abortions, which could only be achieved by granting registered medical practitioners a legal monopoly in providing abortions. Notably, a medical monopoly that prevented quackery was at the heart of shaming language in the mid-19th century. And in 1967, about 100 years later, the Abortion Act furthered this monopoly, ironically, by giving the profession a monopoly in being the sole providers of legal abortion in England. An act just a century prior seen as an infection on mankind. And that is my presentation.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thank
We do have a few questions. So Judy Thornton asked, does the Medical Act suppose that the only persons performing abortions had no medical training? Were there no doctors doing this? Did the act really make a difference?
That's a great question, Judy. Thank you. So essentially, the act itself doesn't mention abortion explicitly. Basically, what it does is it's supposed to bring about this medical register where mostly men, had gone to school and passed exams, and then they would be put in the medical register. What that meant is that they promised to uphold the standards of the profession, whatever that may be. So basically, at this time, abortion is illegal, and so no actual medical man should be performing abortions. So while it could be suggested that if somebody is performing an abortion, they are not a medical man, we always see the cases where I'm a surgeon in the case of Henry Timson. So I think it does make a bit of a difference, just on the grander scheme of professionalization, but maybe not in deterring abortion. I hope that makes sense. I hope that that answers your question, Judy.
There was another question about legalization too. During the 1800s, were abortions illegal? So you're saying they were, but and then she says, or were they legal, but women seeking them considered criminals?
That is also a really great question. So there were actually a few cases in the 19th century where abortion law is, I'm just going to go to a different slideshow here where I talk about it. So there was a case in 1803, the Ellenborough Act was passed, which, oh my goodness. I'm really sorry for the delay. I'm just trying to get up this.
No worries.
So essentially, yes, it was illegal. In 1803, the Ellenborough Act had the death penalty for any sorts of post-quickening abortion. So that was past the 4-month mark. In 1837, they basically said that there was no difference between pre and post-quickening abortion. So all of it was illegal. They just took out the death penalty and instead made it a capital crime. And then in 1861 is when we see the pregnant woman as well as the person performing the abortion being held liable.
So before that time, it wasn't as often where a woman was charged.
Yes, exactly.
Judy just wanted to clarify what was meant by procuring her own abortion.
Absolutely, absolutely. So they use procure and obtain kind of interchangeably at this time. So they use it in cases where women were trying to obtain an abortion, but they also use it for medical men performing an abortion, if that makes sense. It's a little bit confusing because it's used interchangeably to mean different things. So in the Fanny Warboy case, to say that she procured her own abortion means that she actually performed the procedure on herself.
Betty's comment is all the anonymous commentary in the Lancet. How were men able to hide behind the veil of anonymity?
That is a great question. Thank you. This is something that has been sort of plaguing my thoughts as well, is why weren't there names on this? All that you can get at this point is who the editor was of the Lancet. So up until 1862, it was the founder, Thomas Wakely, but they would have people writing in to do these all of the time. So I don't know the answer to that, but it is something that I've also been a bit confused about throughout my time, which is why when Robert Burns writes in, I'm like, nice, you actually put your name.
Betty also wanted to know if you had any more examples of some of the coded language other than female obstruction.
Yes. So I have one up right now, actually. So this is from the Times in 1894. So after my my actual topic, but this one is Audie's unlabeled strong female pills quickly and certainly remove all obstructions arising from any cause whatsoever. Invaluable for married women, post-free undercover, for 14 and 33 stamps, from Thomas Audie, chemist.
Very interesting.
Yeah, so you get things like that, or female challenges you would see often. They would make it sort of related to menstruation, to regulate menstruation. But what these meant were performing abortions, but they couldn't outwardly do it. So I wanted to look, initially when I was planning my research, I wanted to look a bit more at the coded language, but I sort of shifted gears into shame.
Shauna wanted to know, is there any indication in your research that the shame that women face by being named in the newspaper articles?
That's a great question that I wish I had an answer for. Of course, as we know, in history, women's voices are often not at the forefront. And so I never ran into a case where a woman's case was subsequently covered again with her own words. All you get is sort of bits poking through in the trial transcripts, which were printed in newspapers. At the actual Old Bailey level, you actually can't see the court transcripts at all because it says that they are improper for print. So you get them all in the newspapers. So you don't see it anywhere, unfortunately. So I can't say that they felt shamed or what have you, but yeah, I'm not sure. I'm really sorry.
No worries. Karen asks, midwifery has been around for a long time. So according to your research, did the doctors or medical professionals at the time try and abolish midwifery, or just from midwives performing or attempting to perform abortions?
That's another really great question. And if you're interested in that, I do have a really good article about midwifery practices at the time. Essentially, they were just looking to discount midwifery in any way that they could. They claimed that they had greater biological knowledge, and so it in turn comes down to things that have to do around childbirth, whether that's childbirth itself, abortion, infant care, things like that. They tried to really monopolize on. So I don't know if they tried to abolish midwifery. I think the Medical Act does in turn try and abolish midwifery because midwives were not eligible to be on the Medical Act. But I don't know if there's outwardly any attempts to make a midwifery illegal, if that makes sense. So the Medical Act does it sort of like undercover. But yeah, there's a really, really great article that I have that if Amy has your information, I could send it to you if you're interested in reading more.
Great. Fran Voot says she can understand the term quickening, but how could that be determined by someone other than the mother?
That's a really great question. So in a lot of cases, it was if the doctor could feel movement, not necessarily always the mother. So it was determined in part by the mother, but a doctor could confirm it as well.
And then she also asked Rosina at 8 months, was the abortion successful, and were their stats kept on the success rate?
Yeah, so it doesn't completely specify in the newspaper that it was successful. Because they say what they say in the newspapers, I think that it was successful in procuring. I think at that point it would be miscarriage or early labor. But there weren't stats on actual success rates because abortion was considered an underground tactic. We'll actually never know how many abortions actually happened in this time period at all. Typically, abortions that came to trial were ones that had gone horribly wrong, where the woman dies in the case of Sarah Kellum in the Elizabeth Goddard case, where the woman becomes very sick in the case of Fanny Warboy, or where there's sort of scandal surrounding it, like in the case of the McGrath and Rosina Bush affair. That became a big deal. So yeah, so we'll never know the stats, unfortunately, which is a big issue that historians who write about abortion in this period discuss. But yeah, I hope I answered your question.
And Fran also wanted to know, did Mary ingest the prescription mailed to her by the dentist?
That is a really good question that I don't know the answer to. It never specifies in any of the newspapers that I read in coverage about it. So maybe, but I don't know for sure. By the sounds of it, I don't know if she did, because she was the one persecuting Edwin Lowe for sending it to her. So yeah, so I don't know for sure, because that was something that I scoured in all of the newspapers and I couldn't find anything. So I don't know.
And our last question, why were abortions considered so heinous? Was it because of the Hippocratic Oath and the fetus being considered living?
That is
during this time, was that the...
Yeah. So interestingly, I talked about historians Anne-Marie Kilday and David Nash at the beginning. They actually claim that at the time, women really saw abortion as like no big deal, that it happened and it was a way to control your family planning. But it was professionals who tried to sort of impose this this monopoly by giving it this moralistic tone. And I know abortion gets discussed a lot about in the US, of course, because there's still this ongoing debate everywhere, but in the States, it's certainly more prominent about abortion. In America, there were counterparts in the same time period, like Horatio Storer, who talked in the 1860s, and he talked specifically about immorality and about, anxieties about repopulation in Civil War America. But in America, in Britain, they really focus more so on as using it as a means to sort of professionalize their authority. So to the common people, abortion was apparently seen as just, it happened and it was something that you kept hush hush, but it was a way to control family planning. But it was sort of people on the top that made it this sort of this idea of immoral and things like that. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, we do have just a couple more quick questions.
Oh, that's okay.
Babs asked if during that period, if there were men or if there were any women on the medical register.
That's a great question. So as of 1873, so I know that that's a little bit after when I'm looking at, there were 2 women registered under the 1858 Medical Act. So Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell was registered because she had a foreign degree and was already practicing medicine when the 1858 Medical Act passed in England. And then there was a woman named Mrs. Garrett Anderson, and she obtained an apothecary's license and was added to the register because it happened before the Society for Apothecaries forbade women from obtaining a private education. So there's a really great pamphlet that I found, and I got this information from it's the 1873 Bristol pamphlet on the Medical Act in relation to the practice of medicine by women.
Right.
Yeah.
And just a final comment from Wendy Lowe: is not shaming still alive and well in our society today with many topics, not just abortion? Which
absolutely. When I did this presentation for the Brock Historical Society, and somebody asked if I can connect the shaming of abortion in this period to the shaming that's happening surrounding COVID right now. Whether on either side, anti-maskers who are shaming the sheep who are following, and the people who are following, maybe shaming people who are not following the rules as carefully. I think it's certainly alive and well. And I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon. And I think that has a lot to do with what I talked about at the beginning, as shame being sort of seen as this antithesis of honor. And so if you think that you are honorable and somebody is doing something that you think is not honorable, it becomes kind of natural to shame them, whether that's in language like we saw in this, or Facebook comments, or in dirty looks at the grocery store, or what have you. I don't think it's going anywhere because it is such a primary human emotion. And that's what I found so interesting about it. When you look at especially the American examples, it's the exact same arguments for pro-life people today, which I found really interesting. But yeah, I think I think shame is gonna be around forever, and shame has been around forever.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda, for sharing your research with us today. A very interesting topic.
Thank you.
Our next lecture is Wednesday, February 10th at 11 a.m. And our managing director and curator, Sarah Kaufman, is going to talk about our War of 1812 collection, which is one of our strongest aspects of our collection here at the museum. And, you know, we thought we haven't talked about the War of 1812 a lot since the bicentennial. We were kind of taking a little bit of a break on War of 1812 topics. So we're going to dig some of those things out of the collection and highlight that part of our collection. So we hope to see you in 2 weeks and hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
For joining us.